So, as the slide says, welcome to Berlin. I'm really sad that this graffiti is no longer in our entranceway. So I'm actually one of the people who's lucky enough to work out of this beautiful office. So welcome here. I'm really happy to host you all and also to actually meet the ThingsCon community. When Peter asked me to talk, I was like, I have nothing to say about Internet of Things. But I can talk about GDPR. So the focus today is definitely going to be on the relationship between privacy and connected devices, and most notably the impact of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, when it comes into force on May 25th, and the implications for connected devices. So let's start with a brief definition on pointing out that the Internet of Things, or connected devices, are still often referred to as emerging tech. And I say that because for policymakers, when you say emerging tech, that's woo, right? They don't have the answers. But the market is pretty impressive, and with incredible amounts of predicted sales and productions and even more manufacturers entering the scene. There are already an estimated 23 billion devices, connected devices in 2018, and growing up to an estimate of 51 billion within the next 5 years. And let's also acknowledge, and again, I come from a policy background, so I'm a political scientist by training. That also means that the number of connected devices is going to outgrow and develop much faster than the number of people that still remains to be connected, which is one of the primary privacy goals for the digital development for policymakers these days. So while the general concept of connected devices is used to describe many different things, as a rule of thumb for this presentation and for the GDPR, we can say that it's not just a standalone product, but a complex system that involves the device hardware, what we used to call the product, with its sensors and actuators, and the software layer both on the device and on the server infrastructure on the back end. And I'm saying that because it's important to break things like that down into digestible chunks if you talk to an audience that's not as technical. So while this definition in itself can include smart toasters, hoovers, fridges, what have you, I'm going to focus on those connected devices that are truly novel as to how we organize and design our lives. So I am thinking of voice-enabled assistants or sensor-based smart meters or Fitbits, or which potentially have a much bigger chance to becoming integral to your life, because either their interfaces are conversational, like more natural than having to type on a keyboard, because they can help us stay fit and thus healthier, because they help conserve energy, or because they ease family or cross-cultural functional communication and task management. So I'm sure there's a lot more that each of these devices can do for us, but the point is, you're not just adding a product, you're changing your way of life. But however, as smart as these devices may be, they do come with a range of questions. So what about the incredible amount of energy, because convenience is hate, right? What about the incredible amount of energy put into powering these devices, or the waste management of constant renewal cycles? Like, who will actually opt for fixing the devices, and who will simply buy the latest model? And what about their impact on our rights? Declaring privacy dead in the continuously developing data economy has become way too easy. But let's be very clear, privacy is not dead. It just unfortunately increasingly comes with a price tag. Which is why it might be helpful to do a little recap on what we're actually trying to protect. Privacy as defined by the United Nations means that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his or her privacy, family, home, or correspondence. That builds on the critical notion that individuals can only enjoy their freedoms if they have a private space where they can simply be undisturbed or think, like, without prying eyes and ears. So privacy is that part of our lives where we are free to develop our agency. And in the EU, this is reconfirmed in Article 7 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And the Charter also actually uplevels data protection to a fundamental right in Article 8, which is a much stronger protection than we have in the United Nations across the world. So that, in combination with the GDPR, that has and hopefully will continue to inspire similar legislative protection across the world, has significant implications for the development in spread of connected devices. I'm not sure all the policymakers are aware of that. So briefly, for those not yet as familiar with the GDPR, data protection has been regulated on the EU level since 1995 in the form of a directive. By May 25th, 2018, this 95 directive will be upleveled to a regulation. To be clear, until now, data protection has been a common objective in the EU, But the 1995 directive required individual member states to implement this objective into their national laws. So while the EU had a shared data protection regime, implementation varied, and that is going to change. Because as a regulation, the GDPR is a binding legislative act, and it must be applied in its entirety across the EU, which also allows us as citizens and residents, not just EU citizens, but anyone living within the EU, to address your data protection officer wherever you are in your language, which has not been happening before. The European Commission first pitched its plan to reform the EU data protection regime in 2012, which also means it took 6 years and 4 years of actual negotiations to adopt this framework for the digital age. And I've included here at the bottom for awareness the timeline around Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, since these are the ones that are relevant when it comes to cross-border data flows and processing of EU residents' data, so law enforcement acts and all of these. We're not going to go into that at all. So, what exactly is actually going to change, and what do we need to know? First off, we'll have increased data subject rights. To pick just a few, there will be a right to access, which means that all businesses must provide details about data processing to citizens and residents upon request. There's going to be the so-called right to data portability. This means that citizens and residents must be given a choice or agency to change providers without actually losing the benefits of their personal profiles. It also introduces a requirement to notify users of data breaches. So think of the Mirai bot that took down the DIN servers, and hence services like Twitter and Reddit were down for a while, largely because people didn't change the default passwords on their connected devices. GDPR also builds on the notion of explicit consent, and that applies to any company doing business in Europe, even if they're based outside of the EU, which is exactly the gray zones where a lot of people are trying to get on top of everything. On top of that, the GDPR also requires privacy by design. So any manufacturer needs to build in data protection for both products and services, which is interesting because connected devices contain both. And if you're wondering whether data from connected devices might be outside of the material scope of the law, for those of you who have more of a legal background, because it's not personal, then let's also say that the definition of the GDPR on privacy and on personal data is a bit broader than it has been applied so far. For the GDPR, personal data also includes things like name, address, localization, online identifiers such as IP addresses, health information, income, cultural profiles, biometrics, and more. Basically anything that allows direct or indirect identification of a natural person. Also when you process data for other companies. However, it's not yet clear how regulators will actually assess whether and to what extent these rules apply to each device. But if you ask me, it seems pretty obvious that there are multiple challenges. So for devices that, just to take one example, that we use in our homes, questions that will need to be answered from all sides include what data is collected, how is it processed and stored, is it used for profiling and other forms of analytics? So if you're trying to personalize the search results, that probably could go into a form of analytics already. What happens to data from underage kids if they live in a smartly connected household? Because children are subject to special protection under human rights regimes. How are the devices secured? Standard passwords are probably not going to work. And what happens to the data if a manufacturer goes out of business? There's no general or one-size-fits-all assessment, but it seems rather obvious that impact assessments will be required. And this chart has actually been provided by the European Commission to aid businesses to understand what sort of impact assessment they need to do. But outside of data collection and security, we also need to remember the economics. So which divides are being perpetuated with the development and spread of connected devices? Apple's more expensive devices collect less and protect better. People with more income worry less about upgrading to a new device every 2 years, potentially improving their own convenience and energy needs than less advantaged ones. And these are just the obvious, already existing inequalities. Other elements that increasingly make it a luxury to disconnect, coming back to privacy now has a price tag, are, for instance, that our communication patterns and social expectations, we feel that we need to be constantly available, I'm sure you all feel that pressure, I certainly do, to friends and colleagues through email, text messages, social media news feeds, And the services we use are designed to be addictive and only amplify social pressures. So, for example, how high up in the hierarchy do you actually need to be to simply expect people to reach out again after a vacation, for instance, if it was important, and not worry about timely replies or checking your phone if you're on vacation? Or consider public services. Governments across the world are digitizing their services with offline alternatives disappearing. What's more is that new platforms and tech solutions are often first tested on already vulnerable parts of the population, requiring more public support, with privacy and security added as an afterthought, if at all. Or think about profiling. Corporate players have amassed so much data about us, all of us, that they have the most intimate insights into our lives, hopes, dreams, and fears. Data that can be easily misused. Misinformation, political or racial discrimination are just the first examples that came to mind. So if you add to that developments such as smart city concepts, where public cameras are put everywhere to either manage traffic or otherwise ease city life, connected devices, or algorithmic decision-making, if you take that into the IoT space, because I think we use different definitions, and even more such developments, where do we even start to take back our agency, which is protected under the law? As mentioned before, with enough resources, you can opt for more secure, less easily exploited devices, like choosing iOS over Android. You can also pay for a higher insurance rate in lieu of transmitting your Fitbit or smart car data, or you could even pay for a living personal assistant. That world, though, does not protect privacy and our data as it should, and as we need in order to really be free. So let me rephrase and recapture for the ThingsCon Salon, and in particular with a view to connected devices in the future under GDPR. When developing new tools, we need to be aware that the balance between innovation and privacy needs to be considered at all stages of the process. There are risks of surveillance, data breaches, as well as fragmentations, or a new digital device, such as the economic ones, with a view to this connected future. And there are a lot of responsibilities. In fact, that can seem quite overwhelming, right? There's ethical design, there's privacy and security, openness, decentralization, interoperability, and data ownership. But ultimately, it's not an impossible goal. Your primary resource should also be your primary goal, and that's trust. Trust increases the more agency you grant your customers. So to end with a few action points and just open up the debate, because I'm actually quite curious to hear who's in the room and what your background is to have an understanding on where to go. But action points for the different groups that I'm usually targeting in my work. As a manufacturer, you need to be aware of the rules and their implications for your work. Turn privacy into a competitive advantage, notably in a market where trust is increasingly scarce. The guiding question should be, what problem are you actually trying to solve? Does your product device empower individuals in new innovative ways? So do I really need a smart toaster or not, right? Like, what does that do about my life? Does it serve the public good? And if it does, have you designed it in the most rights-respecting and sustainable way? Can I fix it? Is it possible to tinker? Is it interoperable? Stuff like that. As a consumer rights organization, regulations such as GDPR, as well as relevant impact assessments, give you guidance in your work of what to look for when you're investigating violations to urge for change, or if you're looking for best practice examples. And as a policymaker, I think it's pretty clear that policymakers need to move beyond the law and accept that tech is likely always going to challenge known assumptions. What is evident for a product, or even maybe these days social media, where we see enough of the content to grasp the data collection that's behind it or the magnitude of it, it might be far less straightforward in the realm of emerging tech. But however, for policymakers, the goal is ultimately to protect citizens and to make sure that they have what they need to thrive, including in an ever more connected world. So just not taking old concepts, applying it to the new world, but actually remembering of why we're regulating and what we're trying to protect is probably the biggest challenge in changing mindsets that we have when it comes to the connection of GDPR and connected devices. And now I ran through this because I really wanted to get over with this. I was really nervous. So thank you for that. I'm available for questions, obviously, but do you want to go first, or should we take questions? Right?
Question now.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.